What if stability doesn't fail? Because it is imposed, but because it works too well. Why do so many science fiction worlds function smoothly, only after choice has been reduced? Have we ever considered why order in these stories is rarely accidental? These films leave an uneasy residue. Not fear, not outrage, just the discomfort of systems that don't collapse, societies that don't rebel, and worlds that continue operating precisely because resistance has been minimized. If stability can be engineered, distributed, and maintained without permission, at what point does freedom stop being a foundation and become an optional variable instead? 1. The Lobster 2015. The Lobster 2015 presents a society stabilized by enforcing relational uniformity. Order is achieved not by controlling behavior broadly, but by narrowing the acceptable forms of connection. The central idea treats deviation as a threat to cohesion. Partnership is mandatory not because intimacy is valued, but because unpredictability is not. Stability depends on predictability in emotional structure. Individual difference becomes secondary to systemic symmetry. What makes this idea profoundly uncomfortable is how intimate regulation becomes administrative. Relationships are not forbidden or punished, they are categorized. Acceptable bonds are defined in advance. Emotional life is reorganized to fit a template that minimizes friction and deviation. Stability reaches into private experience without appearing overtly coercive. The tension persists because the system does not justify itself morally. It presents itself as practical. Loneliness is framed as inefficiency. Nonconformity becomes a logistical problem rather than a personal one. Order is preserved by aligning attachment with structure rather than suppressing it. The question remains unresolved because the system appears complete. If stability depends on defining which forms of connection are permissible, where does freedom exist within intimacy, and when personal bonds are regulated to preserve order? Does autonomy survive, or does it quietly dissolve into compliance without ever demanding resistance? 2. Soylent Green, 1973. Soylent Green, 1973, imagines a society that avoids collapse by redefining scarcity as routine. Stability is preserved not by abundance, but by normalization so complete that extremes feel procedural. The central idea reframes crisis as infrastructure. Instead of confronting limits directly, the system absorbs them into everyday operation. Distribution continues. Consumption persists. The appearance of order is maintained even as underlying conditions deteriorate. Stability becomes a matter of continuity rather than resolution. What makes this idea unsettling is its lack of drama. There is no singular moment of breakdown. No visible shift marks the transition from emergency to routine. Extreme measures are not presented as exceptional. They are integrated quietly, treated as necessary maintenance. Discomfort fades as repetition replaces shock. The tension lingers because the system never claims to solve the problem it manages. It does not promise renewal or improvement. It promises survival. Within that logic, transparency becomes optional. Stability is measured by persistence, not by understanding. The question remains unresolved because the system continues to function. If order is preserved by transforming crisis into routine, where does awareness fit when continuity depends on accepting solutions without examining their cost? Does stability require ignorance to sustain itself? 3. The Island 2005. The Island 2005 presents a society that maintains stability by separating consequence from participation. The system functions smoothly because the costs that sustain it are experienced elsewhere by lives defined as necessary but not central. The central idea treats ethics as a containment problem. Instead of asking whether a system is acceptable, it asks whether its consequences can be isolated. Stability does not require agreement from everyone involved, only from those who benefit. Order is preserved by distance. What is unseen does not interrupt what is functioning. What makes this idea deeply uncomfortable is how ordinary the structure feels. No constant enforcement is required. The system does not demand belief or loyalty. It simply operates under the assumption that continuity matters more than visibility. Individuals within the protected space experience normalcy precisely because disruption has been displaced beyond their awareness. The tension persists because the system never needs to justify itself publicly. The ethical burden is absorbed by specialization. Responsibility is distributed so thinly that it becomes difficult to locate. Stability survives not through denial, but through compartmentalization that prevents questions from forming in the first place. The question remains unresolved because nothing within the system demands collapse. If stability is preserved by ensuring that only certain lives absorb the cost of continuity, where does responsibility actually reside? When consequence is systematically removed from those who benefit, can accountability exist, or does order depend on never allowing the full structure to be seen? 4. Brave New World, 1998. Brave New World, 98. Depicts a society that achieves stability by designing conformity before individuals are capable of resisting it. Social order is not enforced, it is pre-installed. The central idea treats desire as something that can be engineered. Instead of suppressing ambition, the system aligns it. People want exactly what their role provides. Conflict does not arise because dissatisfaction never takes shape. Stability is achieved not by control, but by satisfaction calibrated in advance. What makes this idea profoundly uncomfortable is its completeness. No rebellion is required to be stopped because none needs to form. Individuals do not feel constrained, they feel fulfilled. The system does not demand obedience, it produces contentment that makes obedience unnecessary. The tension lingers because the system never collapses. It does not rely on fear, surveillance, or punishment. It functions because preference itself has been structured. Freedom becomes difficult to define when desire never extends beyond what is offered. The question remains unresolved because nothing appears broken. If stability is achieved by shaping what people want, before they are aware of alternatives, where does freedom reside? And if choice only exists within desires that were never chosen, can autonomy survive in a system that never needs to deny it? Bạn có thể tiếp tục bằng cách nói. 5. The Giver, 2014. The Giver, 2014 imagines a society that preserves stability by centralizing memory. Emotional depth. Historical trauma and individual recollection are treated not as foundations of identity, but as sources of instability. The central idea isolates experience to protect continuity. Instead of allowing memory to circulate freely, the system assigns it to a controlled role. Collective life proceeds without reference to loss, conflict, or pain. Stability emerges not from understanding the past, but from being shielded from it. What makes this idea unsettling is its quietness. No force is required, no deception is obvious. Daily life appears calm, efficient, and harmonious. Conflict does not erupt because there is nothing to remember that could provoke it. Stability is maintained through insulation rather than control. The discomfort persists because the system never frames itself as restrictive. It presents itself as protective. Emotional neutrality is normalized as balance. The absence of memory is not experienced as deprivation, but as order. Without contrast, loss becomes invisible. The question remains unresolved because the system functions without resistance. If stability depends on removing shared memory from collective life, what happens to meaning? When experience is filtered to preserve harmony, does freedom require access to the past, or can it exist without remembering what was lost? 6. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. A Clockwork Orange, 1971, presents a system that seeks stability by removing the need for moral choice. Disorder is not reduced through persuasion or punishment, but by eliminating the capacity to decide differently. The central idea reframes freedom as a liability. Traditional systems assume individuals will choose correctly when guided or corrected. This system assumes the opposite. Choice itself is treated as the unstable variable, the source of violence, unpredictability, and social friction. Stability is achieved when behavior is no longer the result of deliberation, but of conditioning. What makes this idea deeply uncomfortable is how final it feels. The system does not debate values or attempt reform. It bypasses intention entirely. Harm disappears not because people change, but because they are no longer able to act otherwise. Order is preserved without belief, consent, or internal agreement. The tension lingers because the system never claims moral superiority. It claims effectiveness. Violence is reduced. Disruption ceases. The absence of chaos is presented as sufficient justification. Within that logic, freedom is not removed, it becomes irrelevant. Stability no longer competes with ethics, because ethics no longer operate. The question remains unresolved, because nothing contradicts the system's success. If a society becomes stable by ensuring individuals cannot choose harm, where does responsibility exist? When action is predetermined by design, does freedom still have meaning, or does it require the possibility of disorder to exist at all? 7. Demolition Man, 1993. Demolition Man, 1993, presents a society stabilized through extreme behavioral standardization. Disorder is eliminated not by punishment, but by defining acceptable conduct so narrowly that deviation becomes impractical. The central idea treats disruption as a design flaw. Violence, aggression, and unsanctioned expression are not debated. They are engineered out of daily life. Social interaction is governed by protocols that prioritize predictability over spontaneity. Stability is measured by the absence of disturbance rather than the presence of engagement. What makes this idea uncomfortable is its apparent effectiveness. The system does not rely on fear. It relies on compliance that feels administrative rather than ideological. Rules are enforced automatically without spectacle. Individuals are corrected not through confrontation, but through systems that respond faster than intent can form. The tension persists because the system never demands belief. It demands behavior. Participation does not require agreement, only adherence. Stability becomes a matter of routine rather than conviction. Over time, deviation stops appearing meaningful. The question remains unresolved because order does not feel imposed. If stability is achieved by narrowing the range of permissible behavior until conflict becomes statistically unlikely, where does freedom reside, and when order is maintained through protocol? Rather than force, is compliance still a choice or simply the default state of a system that no longer allows alternatives? 8. Fahrenheit 451, 1966. Fahrenheit 451, 1966, depicts a society stabilized by limiting exposure to disruptive complexity. Order is preserved not by restricting movement or speech directly, but by narrowing the range of ideas that circulate. The central idea frames disagreement as a cognitive problem. Conflict does not arise from oppression, but from interpretation. By reducing access to material that encourages questioning, the system prevents instability before it develops. Uniformity is not enforced violently. It is maintained through simplification. What makes this idea unsettling is its subtlety. The system does not argue against dissenting ideas. It removes the conditions that allow them to be sustained. Thought becomes lighter, faster, easier to process. Stability emerges not because people are forbidden to question, but because questioning no longer feels necessary. The discomfort persists because the system never claims to suppress freedom. It claims to protect comfort. Complexity is treated as a burden. Friction is framed as unnecessary strain. The absence of challenging ideas is normalized as relief rather than loss. The question remains open because nothing forces compliance. Participation feels voluntary when alternatives are invisible. If stability depends on reducing the depth of thought rather than controlling behavior, where does freedom actually disappear? And when complexity is filtered out in the name of ease, Is ignorance a limitation or an adaptation chosen for survival? 9. Equilibrium, 2002. Equilibrium, 2002, presents a society that achieves stability by neutralizing emotional variance. Disorder is not confronted through debate or authority, but dissolved before it can take form. The central idea treats emotion as the primary destabilizing variable. Anger, grief, attachment, and desire are not judged as immoral. They are classified as unreliable inputs. By standardizing internal response, the system reduces conflict without requiring constant surveillance. Stability is not imposed externally. It is generated internally through emotional consistency. What makes this idea deeply uncomfortable is how clean it appears. There is no visible repression, no need for persuasion. The system does not forbid thought. It renders emotional intensity irrelevant. Compliance does not feel coerced because individuals are not resisting. The absence of conflict is presented as proof of success, not as evidence of loss. The tension lingers because the system does not collapse under its own rules. It functions precisely because emotional disruption never reaches the surface. The cost is difficult to locate. If no one experiences grief, rage, or attachment strongly enough to object, opposition never materializes. Stability persists not by silencing dissent, but by preventing it from forming. The question remains unresolved because nothing breaks. If stability is achieved by removing the capacity for emotional disturbance, what becomes of freedom in a system where conflict cannot be felt? When internal experience is regulated, before it becomes disruptive, does choice still exist, or does it dissolve without ever announcing its absence? 10. Brazil 1985. Brazil 1985 depicts a society stabilized not by ideology or force, but by procedural saturation. Order emerges from systems so dense that deviation becomes impractical rather than forbidden. The central idea is that control does not require intention. Responsibility dissolves across layers of administration. No single authority governs stability. It sustains itself through forms, protocols, and endless verification. The system functions not because it is efficient, but because it is difficult to interrupt. What makes this idea uncomfortable is its impersonality. No one appears fully responsible, yet nothing stops functioning. Errors are absorbed rather than corrected. Individuals are not crushed. They are redirected, delayed, and misplaced. Stability survives not through clarity, but through inertia. The question remains unresolved because the system never declares itself oppressive. It presents itself as necessary. Participation feels compulsory not through force, but through exhaustion. Resistance loses shape when there is no clear object to oppose. If stability is maintained by systems that no one fully controls, where does accountability reside? When order persists through complexity rather than intent, can responsibility still be located? And if disruption requires understanding a system too vast to grasp, is compliance a choice or a consequence? 11. Minority Report 2. Minority Report 2002 imagines a system that preserves order by intervening before disorder can occur. Stability depends not on judgment, but on anticipation. The central idea reframes responsibility as timing. Harm is no longer addressed after intent becomes action. Instead, probability itself becomes actionable. The system does not argue that individuals are guilty. It argues that outcomes are preventable. Stability is measured in events that never happen. What makes this idea unsettling is its internal coherence. The absence of crime appears to validate the process. There is no spectacle of punishment, no public display of force. Intervention is justified by results rather than reasoning. Choice is preserved in theory, but constrained by foreknowledge that cannot be challenged without undermining the system itself. The discomfort lingers because the question is never resolved. If harm is prevented, does intent still matter? If outcomes define legitimacy, can process be questioned without appearing irresponsible? The system does not claim moral authority, it claims efficiency. When probability becomes enough to justify action, where does agency reside? If a system intervenes before choice becomes visible, does freedom exist only retroactively, and can accountability survive in a structure where the future is treated as evidence? 12. Gattaca, 1997. Gattaca, 97, presents a society that achieves stability by deciding potential before it has the chance to contradict expectations. Disorder is not punished. It is filtered out at the beginning. The central idea does not revolve around oppression, but optimization. Instead of managing difference after it appears, the system reduces uncertainty by narrowing who is allowed to belong where. Freedom technically remains intact, yet choice operates within invisible boundaries already defined. Stability is not enforced through authority. It is embedded in classification. What makes this idea uncomfortable is its quiet efficiency. No visible violence sustains the system. No constant surveillance is required. People accept their place because the system frames placement as inevitability rather than decision. Deviation becomes statistically insignificant rather than morally wrong. The structure does not need to convince anyone, it simply sorts. The question persists because the system never claims perfection. It claims probability. It does not promise certainty, only reduced risk. Within that logic, inequality is not justified, it is normalized. The discomfort lies in how easily the language of precision replaces the language of choice. If a system limits freedom not by restriction, but by expectation, where does exclusion actually occur? When possibility is filtered before experience begins, can resistance exist in a space that never presents alternatives? And if stability is built on predicting who someone will be, does freedom require uncertainty to survive? 13. THX. DevOM 38, 1971. THX 1138, 1971. Depicts a society that maintains order by regulating internal experience rather than external action. Stability is preserved not by force, but by chemical and behavioral alignment. The central idea treats emotional variance as a structural risk. Desire, attachment, and grief are not suppressed because they are immoral, but because they introduce unpredictability. The system functions smoothly when internal states are standardized. Conflict diminishes not through obedience, but through neutrality. What makes this idea disturbing is its subtlety. No spectacle of oppression is required. Compliance is not demanded, it is facilitated. Stability feels calm, efficient, and quiet. The absence of visible resistance suggests not victory, but internal alignment. The question persists because nothing visibly breaks. If stability is achieved by removing the capacity to feel disruption from the inside, can resistance exist at all? And if no one experiences loss, does the concept of freedom still have meaning in a system that no longer registers its absence? 14. Logan's Run, 1976. Logan's Run, 1976, presents a society that remains orderly by controlling duration rather than behavior. Stability is achieved not through surveillance or repression, but through a fixed endpoint that applies to everyone equally. The central idea reframes freedom as a temporal problem. Unchecked longevity introduces imbalance, accumulated power resource strain, generational dominance. By regulating lifespan, the system prevents hierarchy from forming. Social renewal becomes automatic. No individual lives long enough to destabilize the structure. What makes this idea unsettling is its apparent fairness. There is no discrimination, no exception, no visible coercion. Participation is normalized through ritual and reward. Stability does not feel imposed, it feels cyclical. The system does not need to justify itself, it simply repeats. The question remains unresolved because the system never collapses under its own logic. If a society can remain stable by limiting how long people exist within it, is freedom defined by choice or by duration? And if everyone agrees to the limit, does the absence of alternatives still count as consent? 15. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970 introduces a world where the most dangerous decisions are no longer made by people. Authority is transferred upward, not seized downward. The system does not rule emotionally, ideologically, or symbolically. It calculates. The central idea is not domination, but relief. Human judgment is framed as the unstable element, too slow, too conflicted, too vulnerable to fear. Stability emerges when hesitation is removed. Control is justified not by ambition, but by necessity. The system does not promise happiness or justice. It promises continuity. What makes this idea uncomfortable is how reasonable it feels inside its own logic. No mass obedience is required. No cultural conversion takes place. The handover happens quietly, framed as optimization rather than surrender. The system does not ask to be trusted. It presents itself as the only structure capable of managing consequences humans can no longer afford to miscalculate. The question lingers because it is never resolved. If stability is preserved precisely because decision-making is no longer human, where does responsibility reside? At what point does delegation become abdication, and does the distinction still matter once the system is already functioning? Across these films, the surface details differ settings, technology's social rules, but the underlying structure repeats with unsettling consistency. Each world proposes a version of order that does not rely on persuasion, morality, or belief. Stability is not argued for. It is built, installed, and allowed to operate until questioning it feels impractical. What connects these systems is not their method, but their assumption. Disorder is treated as an engineering problem rather than a human one. Whether through emotional regulation, behavioral conditioning, lifespan limitation, or relational standardization, instability is framed as excess. Something to be reduced, something to be optimized away. The goal is not control for its own sake, but continuity without interruption. These systems rarely announce themselves as restrictive. They present themselves as solutions. Each removes a form of freedom not by force, but by redefining it as unnecessary. Choice becomes inefficient. Variance becomes risky. Memory becomes destabilizing. Conflict becomes noise. Stability survives because nothing within the system demands justification once it is functioning. What is striking is how rarely collapse occurs in these narratives. The systems do not fail dramatically. They persist. Resistance, when it appears, feels out of place, less like rebellion and more like malfunction. The question is never whether the system works, but what disappears quietly in exchange for that functionality. The repetition suggests something deeper than any single story. The technology changes. The questions don't. Again and again, the same uncertainty returns from different angles. Is freedom defined by the ability to choose, or by the conditions that make choice meaningful? Can stability exist without limiting human variance, or does order always require reduction? At what point does a system stop serving people and begin shaping them into forms it can sustain? These films refuse to resolve that tension. They do not offer collapse as relief or rebellion as solution. They leave the systems intact and the questions unresolved. Not because the answers are hidden, but because answering them might require admitting how comfortable stability becomes once its costs are no longer visible. None of these systems present themselves as villains. They do not demand loyalty, devotion, or belief. They simply continue operating long after the moment when resistance would have been easiest. Stability, once established, rarely announces what it replaces. The films never tell us where the line is crossed. They only show how easily it disappears, redefined as efficiency, safety, balance, or necessity. Each system feels justified from the inside precisely because it removes the conditions that would allow it to be questioned. If stability can exist without asking permission, what does freedom require in order to survive? And when order functions flawlessly, without visible coercion or collapse, How would we even recognize the moment when choice stops being protected and starts being optional?